Alright, welcome to a brand new episode of Straight from the Desk. In this episode we will also paint something together, but this video is much more about actually how to become a better painter. I think this is kind of like a slogan that led me a long way through my painting journey. Is also for me the personal strive to be a better painter and to become better project by project. And I think one of the most essential keys to that is actually fighting your fears. And you might think, like, what kind of fears? This is a hobby. But I think like what I realized with myself, but also observing my students over the years, is actually that a lot of the decisions, what kind of model we are going to paint next, is not only driven by the joy of painting, but we also have that we kind of exclude miniatures from our pile of shame and think like, okay, I will paint this one later. And I think we all know that. And this is usually due to, like, I would say two main factors. First of all, it's a technical barrier where you think like, okay, I think this technique would be perfect to paint it, but I can't really use it, and I'm much more a layer and glazes guy, and I think this one would be perfect to actually try glazing on. And you're just not really comfortable with the techniques that you think would be perfect for the project. But one that is much more obvious is actually the fact that you're avoiding certain topics that you feel uncomfortable of painting. And I think life is way too short to actually be like so limited in a hobby like that, just because of only like two main factors that we can really easily split up. For example, the technical aspects of painting. If you think about it, you might think or have that diffuse feeling that there are a million different techniques and it's impossible to handle them all. But if we break it down, we can actually limit it to 9 essential painting techniques. And you might think like, okay, only 9, so let's go through them. And if you've been following the videos for a while, you know that the different techniques are indicated with these little icons. So we have the layering technique, we have the glazing technique, we have feathering, we have a wash, we have wet blending, we have stippling, we have dry brushing, and we have the loaded brush, which I'm kind of associated with. And we have a technique called sponging, where you use something else than a brush. For example, a sponge to create a texture, but also a gradient. So let's have a look at these different techniques. So first of all, layering. Layering is just the application of opaque paints. We can use it to create a gradient by just kind of stacking them next to each other, and the eye does the blending for you. So you don't actively mix the paints on the figure, you do that on the palette. The second technique, glazing, is pretty much the same, but you have a different consistency of paint that you use on the model. So for a glazing technique, you use translucent paints. The next technique is feathering, and feathering describes the act of cleaning off the remains of the paint with water. So it's a technique that you quite often use at the end of a brush stroke or at the end of another application, for example a layer, where you just take a clean brush and lift off the last bits of pigments on the surface to ensure a smoother blend. We also have the wash as a technique where we apply plenty of paint and we want it to gather in the recesses. And this is something that, for example, with a glaze we don't want. We want a glaze to be really like equal thin layer of paint that fastly dries away without creating pools or stains. And the wash is actually a technique that is much more used actually not to create a blending, but to emphasize texture. Another technique that is actually quite important, but this is also a technique that a lot of people fear, is the wet blending technique. It's a technique where you basically mix 2 paints or 3 paints or more paints on the surface directly and blend it on the surface. It's a technique that is super fast and also very versatile, But because of the short drying time of acrylic paints, a lot of people fear that technique. But we will talk about that a little bit later. Another technique that is like really fantastic is the stippling technique. The stippling technique is you basically, instead of trying to get a smooth finish of the paint on the surface, you're creating a texture by simply dabbing with a brush on the surface with different shades. We will also speak about that a little bit later in the video. Alright. One technique that I'm really associated with and that you have been seeing a lot all through the videos, but also in that separate exercise video, is the loaded brush technique. The loaded brush technique is also a wet blending technique and could be also put within the wet blending icon, but I decided, as it's a slightly different use, to separate it also as a technique. The loaded brush is, as mentioned, a wet blending technique, but we're kind of saving a little bit of time by putting two paints in the brush at once. This way we don't have to go back to the palette and we can work them directly and blend them directly on the surface. A technique that I think everyone knows from like the first miniature is the dry brushing technique. The dry brushing technique is also a technique that is rarely used to actually create blending. Some people also do that, but it's actually a technique that is ideal to pick out some texture and also to give it like a textured highlight look. And for that you simply wipe off the brush on a paper tissue until you have almost no paint coming out, and you rub that over the surface to kind of pick out the raised elements of the model. A simple technique that was actually shunned for some years. People said like a professional painter does not use dry brushing. I think with all the techniques, the most important thing is that you actually don't see which technique you used for what result. So in the end, the miniature should be just like something beautiful to look at. The last technique is a very rare technique that like I use rarely, but a lot of people use it more frequently, and it's called sponging. It's you use anything beside a brush and create a blending with that. You can use a sponge, a little bit of like the foam in the blister. It can be a very versatile technique also to create an interesting texture, because a lot of people have kind of like a problem to create a random texture with a brush, and it always kind of looks the same. So with the sponging, it's a little bit easier because you have that random surface of the sponge. All right. If you think that these are all the techniques, sure, there are some combination of these techniques, but if you think that these are basically all the techniques that you need to learn to become a master painter, you might think like, whoa, this is actually kind of crazy, because these 9 techniques are relatively easy to explore. And you could either take one model per technique and kind of dedicate it to that, or you could dedicate certain areas on a model to a technique to try it out. You don't have to be a master in all the techniques, but you kind of should be able to know what technique would be good for what, so you just don't feel that burden of, okay, I have to do it with this and that technique. So you're completely free to kind of pick your weapon of choice. This brings us to the second big factor, and this is really, I think, something quite important. And this was also for me something that was way more than the technical aspect of painting. It was more topics that I feared. So let's say I wasn't happy with my skin tones. So for me, the strategy was the next model that I'm going to paint will be entirely skin tones. It will be a naked ogre. Or if non-metal is not your topic, then why don't paint something big that is just entirely made of armor, which forces you to paint in non-metal that is convincing. And I did it for myself very strategically, like it was skin tones, it was non-metal, it was fabric. And there's also only a handful of materials that we're going to see all over almost each and every model. So we have skin tones, we have varnished surfaces, we have non-metal, true metal, we have fabric, and then we have loads of little tiny materials that are out there to explore. But really, there's also only a handful of main topics. So I think a good strategy is make a list for yourself. Just write it down, see, okay, which are actually the topics that I favor the least, and why is that? And is there a model that I could use to actually fight those fears? And here for our video, I decided to go for a Lucas Pina model. I love Lucas Pina, but I know also a lot of people have kind of like fear painting those models because they are precious, they are beautiful, they are limited, and you feel like, okay, if I'm ruining it, this is just wasted and it's lost forever. But see it like that. A miniature is a mass product still, in most cases. If it's a unique figure, I can understand more fear, but think of that. You can always start new. You can always prime it, you can strip it in like this should be the very last resort actually to strip a model, because even if you don't like the paint job, usually if you don't work really thick, you can also like continue and paint over and over the model until you're happy with it. So a figure can like get 2 to 5 like layers of paint on top of each other without really being visible. So there are more than one versions on your desk. And if you're still not happy, there's always a next model where you can improve. It's also good to just call it done at a point, say, okay, this is the lesson that I've learned, and then continue with the next model. Because there are definitely more models than you could paint in your entire life. And it would be really terrible to just be stopped before actually painting the most beautiful ones. So like, don't wait with the beautiful ones to paint them, because you know, you might think like, oh, I will try out this technique on that a little bit ugly model just to be good with it when I start on the other model. But it's really not easy to transfer what you learned from one model to another model. So there's always the sculpted influences, it's the surfaces, it's teeny tiny things like the texture, the finish of the varnish. So go with the figures that you love, really. Like, a figure that you love will inspire you to create something more beautiful than a figure that you're not sure of. So this was a very long introduction, but I think it's like a very important topic. And here for this video, we will focus on the wet blending technique. As I mentioned earlier, this is a technique that a lot of people fear, and we will use that on a Lucas Pina scab. Also something that a lot of people actually fear to get out of the shelf and start painting it. And we want to talk about all the fine nuances that the wet blending technique has. And we will use the rest of the model to demonstrate a technique each. We will have like the fabric, where we go more for a layer and glazes approach, and we will talk about why we use it. So here, for example, the wet blending is an ideal technique to get started on something like a skin or like a natural organic material, because you can create really like an interesting flow of colors that is kind of separated from the placement of highlight, because the natural material always also needs natural color variation. We will start with that. We will start really relatively rough and then go finer and finer with the wet blending. We'll first work on the material color and define the skin tones that are happening in the face. And in the second step, we're refining those, working on the transitions, still working wet and wet. And then we're continuing placing the lights. So it's quite nice because we can see those steps gradually building up until we have like from a very rough start to like a very nice and defined face in the end. All right, folks. Thanks for your support. I really hope this video inspires you to start fighting your pile of shame. And yeah. Let me know in the comments what topics you fear, what's also the techniques that you don't understand and what's the problem with that. Maybe we can discuss it along in the next videos. All right, thanks for watching, thanks for your support. Now enjoy the fantastic mercenary goblin from Lucas Pina. All right. Okay, here we are with the wonderful goblin from Lucas Pina. And I really love how he managed to create those somewhat whimsical, iconical characters. So they always carry a lot of personality, and we really want to like pay justice to those individual characters by also creating like a very individual like color scheme for him. And as always, skin tones play a very important role to shape the character. So we're starting with our skin tones, and we will use the video to demonstrate how versatile we can use different techniques, but we will start with wet blending, and we will use wet blending in a myriad of different applications, so detailed, rougher, and we will talk a little bit more in detail about that technique. All right, so let's have a look on the palette. Here we have some Schmincke Titanium White. Here we have some Reaper color Mustard Yellow. Here we have some of the game color Scurvy Green. Here we have some of the Reaper paint Blood Red, and here we have some Carbon Black from the Chimera paints. And you can see we have loads of different brands going on, and this is also how I usually work. And sometimes the paints have quite different finishes or consistencies, so we're going to blend them directly on the model. That will lead to some difficulties. So we will start with the application here of the Scurvy Green, and in the beginning we just want to create like an interesting mix and placement of colors that we can work out later on. This is not about creating highlights and shadows. This is really all about creating like the base skin tone with different color nuances. All right, so we're picking up plenty of paint, and we're aiming for like a thick consistency. So between heavy and medium, and it's really plenty of paint in the brush. And we're applying that to one side where we want to have that color more visible, and you can see we're just placing it down, cleaning the brush, and going to the palette and picking up a little bit here of the mustard yellow. And again, it's actually not a little bit, but plenty of it, and I'm applying that here. Just placing it, cleaning the brush. And one important thing is you can see there is a little bit of empty space in between. That is great to have like a mid-tone that is going to happen. So we're taking this paint here and dragging it into that empty zone, and we're blending it here with our mustard yellow. And you can see we have like in really no time, we have like a somewhat beautiful transition, and we can still go in there and manipulate it and push it around until we're happy with like the blending. And this is like quite a linear blending that we've created, and we're going to let that dry. And now that our initial blending is dry, we can see like a few things when we analyze what we see on the surface, and we can see we have like slightly different finishes. The Reaper paint here is quite a bit more flat in like how it dries, and a little bit thicker also like how it here gets into the details, and the game color here is slightly more glossy. So we have that difference. And there's another aspect that we can see is we have like the base color, in our case here solid black, but we have that shining through like differently between like this area and here. So one thing, and this is like especially when you're new to wet blending, that can help to compensate that is actually to work with an intermediate tone just between like those two. We'll just mix that here to the side. And we're going to apply that here as like an opaque layer just underneath. So this way we have like the least distance in between our two extreme tones that we're using for the blending. All right. So now that our base layer here is dry, you can see it's also not 100% opaque, but really that here I think is quite enough. You can see we have like really like a very different situation going on here on the other side with like the super dark and the super yellow tone. And we want to get our extremes back, and we will do that on top. And this, as I mentioned, is really like quite a good help for beginners when they start with wet blending or the loaded brush technique. It can be really super helpful to have that mid-tone underneath. And in the next step, we'll continue again establishing the extremes on top, and we'll put our scurvy green down here. Clean the brush and use the mustard yellow here and blend the colors. Okay, and you can see when the paint slowly starts to get matte, it's a good point to actually stop blending, because then it's the moment where the paint dries and you don't want to rip off the dried paint from the surface. We will continue with like the wet blending on top to really like get the dark here a bit stronger, the darker green. And that's the nice thing, is now we can also work a little bit thinner with the paints and preserve a little bit what we've done underneath. So and you can already see how that creates like a very different result to this here, and is also actually quite a bit thinner. And this is not only because we push the luminosity, because we have a lighter color underneath, but really also because we see like less of the base color that is super dark shining through, and that creates like less of a difference here. We'll continue and establish like the yellow area here. And to kind of get them into like the same level, we're also doing like another wet blending on top here. And I just went to the palette, picked up a little bit more yellow here. And this is like that really like a super rough wet blending to establish like this base color is something that I learned from Jeremy Bonamont. It's sometimes really brutal when you see how it happens. It's just getting the paint on, and it's thick, and he's moving it around, and you think like, holy hell, this cannot end in like a very nice and smooth and detailed result. But you can really push it very far with the wet blending technique. And this here at the moment will just be a good step to get like something interesting going on. So for the nose overall, I want to get like quite a bit more of like the yellow vibe going on. So we're establishing that also here's our base color. For the ears, I want to have like more colors going on, so we'll also here establish the yellow, but then pick up a little bit of the blood red here. And you can see while it's wet, we can not only work in like two tones, but we can really go like in there with a lot of colors. It's just important that you like don't like mix the whole thing, otherwise you just end up with like one big blob of tertiary colors. So here we just want to have like an interesting flow between the green, the red and the yellow, and we'll just continue with that. So here again, like another layer of the mustard yellow, and we'll pick up a little bit of green to blend it to the top. Take a bit of the red, and you can see like we're not really careful at all about the like, amount of paint that we're getting on the surface. You can see how I'm like now already working a little bit more careful here to keep all the different tonal areas. So the red, the blending area with the mustard yellow, where we have these nice orange tones, and where we have like the yellow going into the green. Continue to the other side of the ear as well. I'm now working a little bit thinner already. And I'm adding the red also here to the tip of the ear, so it doesn't really line up like a Jamaica flag. All right, we will continue and create like more intermediate. Okay, just from where we have the placement, I want to also continue and like refine this area here a little bit, and we will do that by first adding a little bit of the scurvy green here to the top, where we want it to remain also a little bit more in the scurvy green tone. And then for the area under the eyebrow, we're picking up a bit of yellow. And now you can actually see how the loaded brush developed. It's like something that just sparked off, like trying to be fast and blending the colors together on the surface. And we're continuing here. All right, in the next step, we'll continue with thinner paints, and we're thinning them down so we can do like thinner wet blendings, and we're doing them on top of our wet blending that we've done initially, so we want that to shine through. So we're working with a medium layer consistency between medium and light layer, and see, I'm applying the yellow here. This also leads to like a better coverage of the yellow area, and then we're picking up a little bit here of the green, doing like a smaller, a little bit more careful blending. Continuing again with the thinner paint to the bridge of the nose here. You can see by just like looking what we've like created here, tonal wise, with our first initial wet blending, we can now go in there and refine the areas bit by bit, also using wet blending. So again here, for example, we have that strong yellow on the lips, so we're first establishing it a little bit more solid here, and picking up a little bit of the greener tone. And then doing like a really short wet blending here. And while it's still wet, just adding a bit more of the yellow. Alright, so far so good for the initial placement of our different colors. We have that nice glowing orange on the nose, and we have these yellow and green intermediate tones. And for the next step, we kind of need to mix these intermediate tones also on the palette to have them ready at hand. So creating almost like a gradient here on the palette where we have like a more yellow tone here, and we're going straight into the cooler green tones here. We also need a bit of the pure yellow and a bit of the yellow with some red in there. This way we have all the mixed tones ready at hand when it comes to placing our highlights. We will also take a little bit of the white and create a mixed tone with white of all of our tones here. So first here with the reddish apricot tone, and here with our intermediate green tone, and up here also with our cooler green tone. We can pick any of these later and create also more intermediate shades, but for the beginning this here is like a pretty solid setup. As I mentioned in the beginning, the first steps here were not about placing highlights and shadows. This here is just the material color. And the next step, we will start to articulate our highlights. And I want to start here with that edge here where we have the cheek and we have our cooler green tone going on. For that, we will just take a little bit of that darker green color here, apply it first in the shadow area, and then jump into the lighter tone that we've mixed on the palette with some white, and we're adding that here and blending the two together. And this is like a way more controlled wet blending than we've done before, so you can see we work quite a bit more localized. You can see we have like a really nice and really pale highlight tone. And here where we're getting into the mixed tone area, we're also first applying a little bit of our warmer green tone. Then we're adding like a little bit of the highlight color while it's still wet. And you can see the difference between those tones is really quite dramatic. So in the next step, we will just create like a mixed tone here in the intermediate area, adding some white to that, and we're using that here. Or the glaze in the intermediate areas. And while this glaze is still wet, we're doing a wet blending with glazes with our cooler green shade here. Okay, and we're continuing here, working our way down. Here where we have more of the yellow, we're also adding it quite pronounced. Grabbing a bit of the intermediate shade here and blending the two together again. For the nose, I'm adding a bit of white here to our mustard yellow, and we're placing our prominent highlight here to the tip of the nose. Going back to the palette, grabbing a bit of the pure mustard yellow to soften it out to the top. And a little bit here of the red mixed tone. Adding a bit more white here. And then just diluting it here on the surface. And you can see I'm pulling it here a little bit on that wrinkle. So with our paler mixed tone, we are also pulling a highlight on the side here. First placing the highlight color and then wet blending it here along the forehead. And you can see I'm blending over all the wrinkles at the moment, because at the moment I don't want to emphasize them. I want to treat the whole forehead more as a plane instead of going for individual highlights, because this is again like an area that I've mentioned in the beginning. It's so full of details that if we already start now to like pick them out individually, that would definitely like kind of create too much information in one spot. And this area is a little bit too tiny to actually like do a proper blending on it, so I'm just placing like the thin glaze that is left in the brush on these little details to pick them out. And also for some of these areas in here where it's really kind of hard to reach, we're not really trying to do a blending, but we're just placing our lights as a layer. And we're trying to build up like the maximum highlight here, just where the different colors meet to create really like a center of interest. And at the moment this is really just like a layer opaque paint. And especially when it comes to these super short highlights, sometimes just 2 layers of paint next to each other can already do the trick and emulate an interesting blending. So overall the area that we're working with is like so small that the eye creates a blending in between those 2 different nuances of the paint. And then going in there again while it's still wet to soft things out. And here with a wet brush you can see we can go in there and feather off this edge here. And feathering is that process of dissolving the last layer of paint that you did using just water. So adding a little bit of the cooler green here. Alright, I think we have already really an interesting situation established. I will continue and also here refine things. For example, where we have the forehead and the warmer colors of the nose meeting, and we will do that by also mixing the two here, wet and wet, on the surface. So applying it first, picking up a bit of the darker paint. But you can see one thing that I've mentioned earlier is when you work with thinner paints, and the thinner you actually go, the faster the paint will dry. This might seem a little bit like an oxymoron, but the medium in the paint actually evaporates quite a bit slower than the water in the paint mixture of a glaze. So really here, for these small ones, you really got to be a little bit faster actually to get a nice wet blending result. See here, the glaze already starts to dry away. Alright, I think you get where this is going, and I will just continue to soft it out here also on the other side, and we'll be back for the next step. Alright, okay, I continued a little bit with our wet and wet, and we want to continue sharpening out a few of these elements here. And we've now, I think, reached a level where we can also continue a little bit just with layers and glazes to pick out a few areas, really in a pronounced way. And for that, I'm mixing a cool highlight shade here. You can see we're working with it more on a light base tone consistency. And so far we have achieved really a nice and soft look, but we want to get a little bit of that definition in that good looking model needs. Mixing a brighter shade on the palette, also again in layer consistency. Oh, that one was a little bit too big, so I'm going back to the palette, mixing a slightly darker shade. And then we're taking that back. Okay, we'll use that layering step also to paint in our eyes, and we will start with a nice mixture of the mustard yellow and some white. Also mixing a darker shade, adding a tiny bit of black here. And I'm using that to the lower side of the eyeball. I'm using just a wet brush and a teeny tiny dab of red. Okay, in the next step I'm sharpening the eyelids a little bit. Here we need a slightly more warmer green shade. And because I really like the highlight color here from that side, I'm also using it a little bit on other areas. And one thing that we still need to do is we still need to balance the highlights. You can see the one on the nose is really like super sparkly, and either we could tone that down or boost the other ones a little bit. And I first want to boost the other ones, like the main highlights here on the cheeks a little bit stronger, before actually also tuning them down altogether. Just glazing them out a little bit here. We also want to add a little bit of color variation on the cheeks, and I'm adding a little bit of red here in that area, and we're doing that with the glaze. So picking up a little bit of red and thinning it down with the water and the brush. And you can see that this here is somewhere between a heavy and a medium glaze tone consistency. And you can see what will happen here is quite an interesting effect, because the red and the green are complementary colors. The first thing that we will see is it will just actually appear quite a bit darker here and create a nice bit of contrast. Going a bit more opaque. It was too opaque, so I just took it off with a wet brush again. We'll also mix a pink tone and add a bit of the green here. And we will use that here carefully in the transition area. And then again working with a bit more of like an orange tone. just softening things out a little bit with a glaze of the highlight color here, with being a little bit on the cool green side again. Okay, next step we will continue with the glaze of the initial color here. Glaze it out a little bit here towards the shadow side. Also emphasizing the highlight on the chin quite a bit more. And you can see once we have like a good color and a good consistency in the brush, you can just use it here to glaze things out, to connect them and pull them together. Okay, as a next step we want to detail out the eyes a bit further, and we're starting to mix like a dark red. Followed by a dab of the pure red. Oh, but only in this one because the other one is actually a little bit too smaller. The next step we'll just add like a nice sparkly highlight on top. Okay, this one turned out a little bit bigger, so trying to get them at least to the same size. I like that quite a lot. Okay, we will also try to add like a very small light here in the corner of the eye. And here we still need to sharpen things out a little in the shadow area, and I've just added like a teeny tiny dab of black. I want to use that here to get like a nice and sharp definition on the side. And I'm also using that darker shade here to get a little bit of shadow. And you can see that a little bit of shadowing here to the side really also helped again to make it more believable, because it nicely fades out underneath that cloth that is wrapped around his face. All right, that bit here concludes the face, where you can really see like all the advantages and also a few disadvantages of the wet and wet blending. And we've achieved this with, I would say, 90% wet blending. So you can see there's really like a very broad use of like starting with the really rough and vast one in the beginning and going finer and finer until we have like a really nice and pleasing result. Sure, for some of the details it's definitely better to use other techniques, but we will speak about this when we continue on our model. Alright, thanks for watching, thanks for your support, see you for the next video. Alright.